Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this rainy evening. My name is Fuad Ali, and I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Debojyoti is an anthropologist who focuses on the borderlands of eastern India and the Indian Ocean. His work is interdisciplinary and uses his training as an ethnographer and archival researcher with visual media and oral sources. His current research looks at highland agriculture, which we'll be talking about today, climate change, migration, and community livelihoods amongst indigenous groups in the Indian Ocean littoral region. He's taught at undergraduate and postgraduate levels at Birkbeck, SOAS, and Reading, and has published in the Journal of Borderlands Research as well as EPW and Himalayan Research. I came to know Debojyoti about 10 years ago when we were both postgraduate students in London, and he's been very brave and he's really struggled he's faced a lot of challenges and struggle in producing this knowledge which he's going to share with us today. So I'd like to congratulate you on launching your book, and I'll leave it to you to speak, and then we'll have questions and answers later.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Fuad for introducing me and the Brick Lane Circle for organizing this event. And it is very timely that we discuss about these issues, because the communities that I'll be talking about today, the Nagas, have had one of the longest struggle in South Asia against state power. So their struggle began with the British coming and conquering the region. And it continues even today. And I'll be showing you some slides of how the Nagas have progressed over time. And here, the book is not only about Sweden. It's a very confusing term. It's a term that has been coined by the Europeans, because the word Sweden emerges from a Finnish kind of terminology. And George Condemnus, who is one of the authority on Sweden studies, kind of highlighted that in the late 18th century. In fact, the most of the people living in the civilized world started with shifting cultivation, or Sweden, or Jhum, as we know in the Northeast. So it's a kind of a rhetoric to now put that question that we are civilized and they were not. But we started with that premise. We started with that stage of development. So this book actually develops a kind of critique of the whole idea of development, and it also kind of questions the whole idea of democracy, in the sense that democracy can be very positive for some people, but it can be disenfranchising for others. So in the whole kind of contextualization of this book, I have brought in ideas of patronage, ideas of ballot politics. I've also talked about ideas of modernity, and how modernity can be a very problematic term, and the whole question of modernization itself can be a very problematic term for communities who live at the margins of the nation state. So the question of the state becomes very central in my study. Now I will start by narrating how I kind of went about writing this book. I will also highlight on some of the chapters that I have included in the book, and then it will be open for questions. And if you have any queries, I would welcome to kind of answer them. So I will begin with this narrative. So this is the village, as you can see behind, where I did my fieldwork. It is 280 kilometers away from Kohima, which is the town where the British first established their political headquarters in the hills. And it's very close to the Myanmar border. It is on a ridge which works as a watershed between India and Myanmar. And this territory, until the 1960s, according to Edmund Leach, who was a professor of anthropology at London School of Economics, defined it as the blank space of the empire. So these areas were not mapped. These areas remained outside the direct administration of British Indian government, and they were also not part of the Burmese territory. So they produce a very fuzzy space, a borderland that remains unmapped, that remains beyond state control, which James C. Scott, a political scientist from Yale University, defines as the Jomia in his book called Seeing Like a State. So I would actually take that pedestal because it would then help me to kind of move around and kind of show you the different slides, because many of us in the room may not be aware of that region and the kind of interactions that the Nagas have had in the context of South Asia and the Indian Ocean world. So I will start here with this slide, but let me give you the contextual background. So the title of the book can be easily confused with Sweden, the name of a country, if you do not carefully read the spelling. This is common English name for slash and burn farming, practiced all across the tropics, from Latin America to Papua New Guinea, which lies north of Australia. In the northeast, it is locally known as jhum. So there are very different names given to jhum cultivation. In northern Sri Lanka, it's called chena, and there are local vocabularies which define this term. In this book, I've tried to persuasively argue that the negative expressions associated with jhum, that it means burning of forest, blackened landscape, forest fires, are all part of a systematic transformation and are no longer static entities, which I would explain later. The colonial and post-independence imagination of jhum cultivation as primitive, wild, unproductive has been investigated in the book by showcasing how jhum farmers have adopted innovations in their farmland through various forms of agroforestry and mixed crop husbandry. The book is not only about jhum cultivation, but covers a broad geography that American political scientist Professor James Scott calls zomia, or the ungoverned space in South and Southeast Asia's highland, traversing from the Hindu Kush mountains in Pakistan, Afghanistan borderlands to the west to Malaysia and Indonesian archipelago in the east. All across the South and Southeast Asian mountain highlands, we see Sweden as a dominant form of livelihood. It's a very important point to note. To start with, I would like to thank my well-wishers, field researchers, my host in the study village, friends and family, without whom this book could not be completed, and to the Brick Lane Circle for hosting the event. In August 2018, and this relates to this image, the Prime Minister of India implored a new peace accord to end the long-drawn India-Naga armed conflict. Discussions surrounding armed conflict has been the dominant spotlight in major newspaper columns, books and literature of the last 7 decades post-India's independence, from Nehru's philosophy for NEFA to Modi's peace accord with Naga leaders. And here you can see a very interesting postal stamp that was issued in the late 1950s, where Nehru is trying to reconcile with this problem post-India's independence. My book takes a departure from this dominant narrative by looking at everyday life and politics in Nagaland through the frameworks of people's livelihood and their encounter with colonial and post-independence Indian state, as well as the global framework of rural development. In my case, Sweden improvement in eastern India. Through the politics of Sweden development, I engage with the question of state violence, counterinsurgency, missionary modernization, ethnic identity question in India's northeast. My perspective lies in understanding people's everyday engagement with the Indian state through democratic forms of ballot politics, developmental monies, patronage, corruption, and agency of ordinary Naga farmers who selectively accept packages of development depending on their aspirational needs to catch up with the outside world. Through changing food habits such as the preference of rice over oats, buckwheat, and millets, crops of the so-called uncivilized and primitive people. To give an overview, I should provide a brief sketch of what is involved in Sweden farming, locally known as jhum cultivation in northeast India. Jhum is a form of rotational, semi-nomadic farming practice in the highlands of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, currently undergoing major transformations of state and donor-driven international development programs. For example, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Program, Ford Foundation's Agricultural Modernization, and similar other programs. In my study region, the program was funded by the India-Canada Environmental Facility, a consortium that was established by the Government of India as a nodal agency. It is a cooperative venture among national governments, the World Bank, the UNDP, and the UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program. As part of the program, the Nagaland Environment Protection Through People's Action was formed as government-organized NGO to help Sweden farmers redeploy their farming through by harnessing locally grown crops at a commercial scale. So the whole idea about this writing this book emerged in 2006-2007 when I attended a seminar at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, where one of the professors, who is emeritus professor, his name is P.S. Ramakrishnan, who is an environmental scientist, kind of was a part of this committee which was formed by the government of India and the India-Canada Environment Facility. And after the lecture, he invited me to his room and he said that, why don't you look at this project, how it functioned, whether it has been successful and whether it has failed. So I went into the library, JNU library, and started looking into literature which kind of explored these problems. And soon I came out with a research proposal, which I then submitted to the SOAS University, and that got funded. And the initial project was not looking at shifting cultivation at all. It was looking at developmental practices within an international organization and how different actors and actants work and what are the outcomes of development. But then when I went back to the field, I realized that it was very difficult to work with the development agency staff because they would not kind of tell me the truth. They would just try to show the brownie picture of their developmental activities. So I then decided to live in the village and develop the field-based knowledge and start working on my thesis. So if you look at the next slide, you will see that shifting cultivation is still a significant form of farming across the global south. So according to a statistics published in Human Ecology Journal, special issue on Sweden farming in 2009, there are 34 million Sweden cultivators across the globe. And the Nagas are here, located in the northeastern highland, bordering with Myanmar. However, changing patterns of farming and agroforestry programs have led to a decline in Sweden agriculture. One of the most talked about impact of Zoom farming is its impact on local hydrology, soil erosion, contribution to greenhouse gases that is leading to deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and global warming. So these are the common jargons used by developmental organizations, NGOs, international aid agencies who see, and even national governments who see Zoom as highly unproductive, counter to what is the dominant narrative that we should reduce our carbon footprint. But interestingly, when I was doing my fieldwork, I realized that it is more complicated than what is normally described within the dominant environmental discourse that is going on today. So in the book, I have tried to contest this narrative by showcasing how local innovation and donor-driven development create opportunities and incentivize to change land use from pure slash and burn to tree plantation, horticulture, and different forms of sedentary agriculture. These changes have come not through technological and scientific intervention by government agencies, but due to changes that have come in people's faith. In my case, the people's kind of movement from animism to baptism, and ways Christianity has evolved from below by adopting local customs, traditions, and institutions that has infused new ethics of time, labor, and work habit, which I will detail later. One of the classical ways this transformation has come through is through the change in reciprocal relation between Naga village patrons, the village headmen. I think this is a very interesting picture, and it's about Sweden, which is practiced in Finland and not in South Asia. So the Sweden cultivation is all gone in the European continent, but here is a picture from the archives, which a sketch, in fact, which shows how shifting cultivation was a predominant form of livelihood some centuries back in the continent. And then we go to South Asia. It's a picture from Thailand, and it's taken from the National Geographic, which shows that Sweden cultivation, as it was conceived to be bad, is no longer the case because people have kind of made a lot of innovations in these farming practice. One of the classical ways this transformation has come, as I have explained, is through what we call as the Feast of Merit. So in classical Naga society, village chiefs organized annual Feast of Merit after the harvesting season. By offering feast, the chief maintained his centrality and gained respect and prestige within the village. Clan members depended on him for land, and the chief in return needed manpower to till the land. Anthropologists who have worked among the Nagas, such as Professor J.P. Mills, Professor J.H. Hutton, and Professor Christer von Human-Hommendorf, have defined it as Feast of Merit, through which so these so-called primitive societies, the heads of the would gain prestige. But this has changed over time, and that is the kind of crucial point that needs to be learned from it. The villages would offer a percentage share of their produce to the chief's family, who would in return look after their everyday needs all year round. The entry of the missionaries, particularly the indigenous Baptist village church leaders, which I'm using it within quotes, because in Nagaland, as in many other parts of the world, the missionaries came either from the US or from the UK, and they baptized the local people. But when I went to do my fieldwork, I didn't see any one of them, because they have already been there was the exodus of missionaries after India became independent in 1947. So who were these missionaries? And these missionaries were the vernacular local people who had come from the other dominant tribes and started to preach the mission work. By mission work, I mean ideas of improvement, ideas of hygiene, ideas of development, ideas of progress, ideas of peace and modernity. So that's very important to understand when you understand the Zoom landscape. So it's not a kind of technological change from primitive agriculture to modern agriculture, but how different social institutions kind of bring about change within a society. So the entry of the missionaries, particularly the indigenous Baptist village church leaders, changed this dynamic in the village for good, as over the last 5 decades, the church has become the center of reciprocal exchange between Baptist villagers and the village pastor, who run the village church through donations given by church followers. Unlike the Catholic churches, the churches in Nagaland depend on the village for their functioning. I will return to this change in the later stage of this discussion. The history of the Nagas' origin and dispersal remains complicated and are embedded in local legends and folk songs, because there is no, the Nagas don't have a written script, so it's very difficult to understand, because there are different legends which says they have either migrated from China or they migrated from Southeast Asia, from Thailand, so it's not very clear and it's a very contested space. Naga territories were always independent of their neighbors. In fact, many scholars claim the Naga villages were village republics. They were very self-sufficient before the coming in of the British. They were independent and only dependent on salt from outside, which obviously came from the coast of the Indian Ocean. However, they were also vassal states or tributary chieftains to the Ahoms. So the Ahoms actually lived very close to the Nagas, which is part of Assam, where we get the Assam tea from. The Ahom kingdoms allowed Nagas to collect tax from the foothills in order to maintain friendly relation and to avoid pillaging, headhunting raids over the plains. Also, they had provided khat lands in the foothills for Nagas to impose tax on the local population. In that way, the relative autonomy of these two different principalities were maintained in the eastern part of India. The Ahoms came under the direct administration of the East India Company after the First Anglo-Burmese War in 1826. The Treaty of Yandabu automatically transformed Assam and the adjoining hill areas inhabited by Nagas under British administration. For the empire, Assam was a prospective and profitable resource frontier. The discovery of tree and petroleum in Upper Assam opened the land for prospective tea speculators and syndicates based in Calcutta to lay claims for wasteland grants. This was followed by the discovery of coal and limestone that added prospect for provincial revenue generation. The commercial success of tea plantation in Assam ended Chinese monopoly over tea in the late 19th century. The expansion of tea gardens in the foothills soon interfered with Naga Jhum fellows in the hills that met with bitter resistance that followed raids by Nagas on tea gardens. Coolies. Between 1850 to 1860, some accounts suggest that 200 coolies were killed in the Assam tea gardens and their heads were taken to the hills. To settle the crescendo and to secure the land grants of British investors, the colonial government passed the Bengal Frontier Regulation in 1879, popularly known these days as the Inner Line Regulation. The Inner Line banned plain people from entering the Naga hills without a permit issued by the government of India, and that continues even till today. If you want to enter the Naga hills, you need a permission from the government, and that is only valid for a certain period of time. In fact, I was given a permit to enter the region, and I would come out of the region, make a new permit, and enter the region to do my fieldwork. So it's a very interesting dynamics. But what I discovered after looking at archival records in the British Library, that the intentions of the government where although it was there to kind of protect the natives from outsiders, the ground kind of modalities were different. The way they executed these plans were to benefit the British capitalists who would invest in this area. It altered once and for all the relationship between the hills and the plain. The inner line set the limit for plantation extent over Naga territories, but in practice, local officials worked in favor of the tea syndicates to extend prospective boundaries of the Assam-Bengal Railway Company, the Forest Department, and the tea planters. Instead of protecting the interest of the Naga Jhum cultivators, it became an instrument to make changes in the topography and land use that would alter once and for all the age-long relationship between the Assamese and the hill tribes. I will show you some pictures later which will kind of further enlighten this. In fact, I've written a paper in the Economic and Political Weekly which came out this year, which explains in details about this kind of complexity. For example, the free trade between the hills and the plains were now controlled by the colonials and were taxed. The search for grouping communities into races of varying colors and physical features led to the development of a genealogy tree based on exchange and circulation of artifacts of material culture that linked the Nagas with primitive types of the Pacific Island. And here is one example. These beads, which are the Nagas use in their common, in everyday life, these kind of came from the Polynesian, Melanesian group of islands, and that kind of was picked up by the colonial anthropologists to kind of develop the racial hierarchy. And if you go to the Pitts River Museum today, you'll find a very interesting kind of diorama where how the civilization has been arranged. So you find the Nagas at the bottom of the civilization, and as the civilization ascends, we come to the European kind of stage or to the Americas. So, for example, so what I was trying to say here is, in this context, the search for grouping communities into races of varying colors and physical features led to the development of a genealogy tree based on exchange and circulation of artifacts. So this ethnography undermined the local barter economy and trade networks that historically existed between the hill and the plain people. For example, the circulation of dry fish from Chittagong and salt made in Shandip Islands in present-day Bangladesh were regularly traded with country boats through the Brahmaputra and its tributaries in exchange for cowrie shells, opium, honey, wool, and wax. Hut bazaars were set up all across the foothills to facilitate trade and local commerce. But with the coming in of the border post and the inner line regulation, soft borders were hardened. So I would like to show you one example. Like as I have said, this is a continuation of the picture that I showed earlier, which actually carries the symbolic identity of the Nagas, which links them to the Pacific and other islands. Here is this example. So I was passing through this place. It's called Naginimora, which is between Assam and Nagaland, and it's the foothills where weekly hut bazaars are opened. And these hut bazaars have been there for centuries. And this is the place where people come and meet and kind of exchange goods. They have good conversation. And this is the kind of network that within which the Nagas kind of exist with their neighbors. But then these networks were completely kind of debunked by the colonial state, which wanted to have control over these territories. So that kind of flexibility was in a way impinged by their intervention. So I would now give a small history, the political history of the Naga Hills, which is very important because most of you are not aware of the region, may not come from that region. So it's important to know the political history in a snapshot. So in 1879, the Nagas were brought under British administration with only and the Kohima was the administrative headquarters from which the British kind of controlled the Nagas, but that was indirect control. It was not direct control because they had village headmen who would kind of report to the deputy commissioner, and he would kind of have administrative control over these territories. And there would be annual tours in which Professor Führer Hammondorf also participated in 1936 with J.P. Mills, who later went on to become professor in one of the big universities in the UK after his tenure in India. And that's very interesting because during the Second World War, the Nagas fought with the British to thwart Japanese advance over Kohima. And in the Simon Commission, as you know, it's a very important period, the Naga Club was formed, and they petitioned to become a separate nation. And they argued for a separate nation because they have nothing to do with the Indian state, and that was the argument. Then in 1947, the Naga Akbar Haidari Agreement was signed by the government of India. through which the Nagas kind of ethnic identity was kind of foregrounded. The government of India acknowledged that. Then there was trouble between that period from 1947 to 1960. 1960, where there was a lot of insurgency, mass raids, killings. So the 16-point agreement was signed by the Naga leaders with the government of India, particularly the Naga People's Convention, that led to the formation of a separate state of Nagaland in 1963, and the incorporation of Article 371A, which gives special rights to the Nagas with relation to their land, in relation to their resources, in relation to their kind of customs, which need to be protected from the outside world. Then in 1975, a ceasefire agreement was signed between the government of India, and that took place in Shillong. And finally, we come to the 1996 peace accord, which is continuing. There is a ceasefire in place. When I was doing field work, it was the ceasefire situation between the government of India and the Naga rebels. And this ceasefire is continuing, and there, in 2018, there has been a new ceasefire agreement signed between the government of India and the Naga rebels. So now I will go to the next section, where I will go to the main crux of this book. So in the first chapter, I introduce the practice of jhum farming in Nagaland and how it has been described by various colonial officials and international policy institutions. To illustrate with one example, John Rowntree, who was a colonial official serving in the Assam Forest Service in 1940, in his book A Chhota Sahib, Memoir of a Forest Official, published in 1981, records his frustration in dealing with the problem. So he writes, "Jhuming is one of the most serious problems in the hills of Assam, and one which we, the Forest Department in our time, failed to solve, despite many attempts to do so. In the reserve forest, villagers were allowed to jhum in unproductive areas on the condition that they would plant the land with forest once they moved on, a practice known as Tangya. And Tangya is actually a practice which evolved in the Karen territories of Myanmar. And it's a very important form of farming, which was an innovation that the British introduced, and it completely failed. So it also failed in Assam. And so this frustration continues in the post-independence period, where the government is trying to kind of settle the Jhumias and trying to map their mobility. So in chapter 2 of the book, I describe the methodological issues, which I think is very central for future researchers also. And the methodological issues involved in doing field work in a dangerous field. These challenges can range from frostbite to hostage crisis in a ceasefire zone. During the colonial period, the relationship between the researcher and the researched was based on a power relation, where the subject of study were given no voice. The researcher as an expert was the self-interpreter. During the late 1960s, a crisis emerged within the discipline of anthropology as anthropologists colluded with the CIA to carry out espionage missions in Southeast Asia and Latin America. These raised serious ethical questions on how ethnography should be done, which many anthropologists called for self-reflection of their own research. It led to seminal publication in the field that called for auto-ethnographic accounts. The challenge and ethical issues involved in doing research in a dangerous field, such as the counterinsurgency complex where I worked, comes with innumerable pitfalls. Even sickness can endanger the prospect for fieldwork. In my case, I was diagnosed with tuberculosis in the early half of my research. In the field, I was helped by my interlocutors and informants. I would like to recall the help rendered by my field interlocutor, Mr. Kamal Singha, then a lecturer at Kohima Science College, who drove me to the nearest TB clinic to buy medicines before I started the day's fieldwork in the study village. Building rapport and friendship is central towards gaining trust within the community. When I first started working in a Imchungar village, there were suspicions about my research in the region. The village people initially identified me as a spy and a government informer. It took me several months to build friendship by taking part in daily activities in the village, like sowing seeds, harvesting crops, attending Sunday Bible service in the village church. One day, the village women church leader announced during a Bible service that you are one of us. I felt like I was initiated into their clan. The importance of participation is further enhanced through apprenticeship. Through apprenticeship, we get to know the inner working of the community. But one event in the field really transformed the perspective of my fieldwork. By that time, nearly 6 months had passed in the village, and I had developed good links with the local politicians whose father had been a member of the state legislative assembly in Nagaland for 4 terms. He proposed that we visit his farm in the middle of my fieldwork, and it was on one faithful Sunday evening that we were traveling to his farm, that suddenly we were stopped by 4 armed guards who smashed our vehicle headlights, and immediately our car stopped with a violent jerk. The driver got injured from the pistol butt that was smashed in his head. Soon blood-stains soaked my arms. The police and the political leader had changed his car to bluff the assailants, but it failed. Soon we were taken hostage and the public leader was beaten up. After a quick negotiation between the local political big men, we were released the next day with a declaration of peace and friendship. Soon public pressure grew to bring the assailants to justice by the political leader in one of his public speech, which I attended, holding the Bible in his hand, declared in public meeting that like Jesus, he will forgive his sinners. All these events made me more confused, fearful, and suspicious of my safety. But the village elders who had come to see me from the study village assured that they will take care of my security and that the compromise letter would act as a safety valve between the competing groups. With these assurances, I decided to return back to the study village. My return to the field helped me unfold the complexity of development aid I had seen during the first few days of my visit to the field. So I went back to visit my host, who was my host in the village, and during my first few days of my stay with him, he had taken me to the village to show one of the road development building project. So this is the picture of Nagaland, and this is, before I go into that slide, this is the composition of the Naga tribes at present. Like there are more than 30 Naga groups, and they're spread across India, Myanmar, and within India they're spread across Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, and the current demand by the Nagas is to have a Nagalim, that is United Nagaland, that encompasses all these territories. So this was the road building project. I was present in the inauguration, the day of the inauguration. So the violence that led to our kidnap was related to the road building work and developmental money that was siphoned off by local government officials and factional groups. My host protested these cuts as he failed to register his share and was warned through the kidnap not to oppose such appropriation of public funds. So here comes the politics of development. The public leader had to bring the community together in order to secure his political future as he was aspiring to become the next MLA. Therefore, the compromise deed was signed despite his supporters' pressure. The village itself was divided between the Baptist and the Catholic followers. During my interviews, I was sensitive to the backtalks by followers of two denominations by not taking side with one group. In that way, I averted being branded as supporter of one faction. Even my residence in the village with one influential village leader risked alienation from other clan members who did not have good relation with my host. Therefore, I decided to divide my time with important villagers through participating in church activities. Without building trust and rapport with villagers, I could have never succeeded in completing my fieldwork and develop the ethnographic narrative with my co-workers. I often relayed my interviews back to my respondent to see what they felt about my interpretation and observations, and often they influenced my writing and also influenced my narrative. Collaboration in this context played a significant role in overcoming misrepresentation, because there has been several misrepresentations with relation to Naga culture and custom and their history. While doing fieldwork, I also contracted with smallpox, a tropical infection. Therefore, my advice for future generation researchers will be to be fully aware of the challenging circumstances while doing fieldwork. The other point that I learned while doing fieldwork was being empathetic and sensitive to our interlocutors' daily chores. We need to gain access to the community not only by building trust and rapport, but also being appreciative of their hard life. I enthusiastically participated in harvesting paddy from the field by dipping my feet in the leech-infested rice fields, and on several instances volunteered to sleep in the makeshift hut built in the field during the harvesting season. On another occasion, I took part in the village survey carried out by the government irrigation and handloom department. All these acts of participation counted at the end as I came very close to the village community, and the villagers started acknowledging my presence. In chapter 3, I turn on to the idea of violence. The practice of Jhum, according to colonial administrators, involved rituals that were against civilization, like taking heads that they carved by taking punitive expeditions, by undertaking punitive expeditions. According to Naga customs, taking head of enemy villages proved their manhood and was essential to fertilize the Jhum fields. Abandoning such practice would bring famines and death. The colonial administration brought an end to this practice by punishing Naga villagers during annual tours. In the chapter, I describe how colonial attempts to curb Naga headhunting in administered Naga villages also led to false raid on innocent villages, burning of settlement and granaries, and mass atrocities on Nagas that resulted in famines and produced violence that had genocidal impact. In fact, Felix Pedal, who has worked on the corns of central India, writes that the colonial attempt to stop human sacrifice in central Indian highlands, presently in Chhattisgarh, led to physical violence over the natives. In the post-independence period, the violence took the form of counter-insurgency campaign to quash Naga insurgency against the Indian state. In chapter 4, I focus attention on the idea of signs of empire, whereby I argue that in northeastern part of India, particularly in the hill tracts, the concern of the empire was to stabilize its frontier and to maintain rule over mobile Sweden farmers who could not be counted through census or text. Therefore, settled agriculture through the popularization of terrace rice cultivation became a means to bring about political control and improvement in Naga society, and not necessary agrarian change that were proposed by the Central Agricultural Committee during their annual conferences held between 1920s to 50s in different parts of the empire, right from Africa to Latin America and Southeast Asia. So in the next chapter 5, I discuss the study village where I lived and conducted my fieldwork. And this is the violence, or I mean to say that some documentation of the violence that was carried out. So these are very documented pictures of Assam Rifles men kind of going and raiding Naga villages. I have not put the picture of burned villages, which came out in London dailies like the Illustrated London News and many other newspapers. But these were seen to be very productive because they were seen as raids that would counter not only headhunting but slave taking. Human sacrifice and slave taking, because in the 1930s there was this anti-slavery commission which was established, and after the First World War they decided to end slavery all across the empire. And I've written an interesting article that is on slavery. It's a kind of, the article is about how in Myanmar, Judith Butler, who was the governor of Myanmar from 1924 to 1928, kind of carried these symbolic expeditions in the highlands of Burma, and kind of used items of modernity like gunpowder and many other, like the gramophone, to kind of subdue the chiefs and tell them the story that, look, if you don't stop slave taking and if you don't stop human sacrifice, you would be penalized. Because in Myanmar, the colonial state had very limited control over the highlands, unlike in the northeastern part of India, where they had established political control in the late 19th century. Why that is important is because once the slaves were released from their masters and the slaves were paid money, in fact, the slave release payment was around 8,000 pounds in those days. And after the slaves were released, they went into destitution, into kind of complete disarray. And the colonial state reorganized that kind of relationship between the chiefs and their slaves. And that was a complete kind of failure on the part of the colonial state to understand land relation in that social context. So the villagers were active both in, so in chapter 5, as I have mentioned, as you can see, there are some other images which I've taken from Peter Hammondo's collection, where they showcase the Nagas to be very lazy. They are kind of always drinking homemade beer, which has also been used by other kind of, by the missionaries and also by the Indian state and other developmental organizations. And here you can see J.P. Mills, who was the deputy commissioner of the Naga Hills, rescuing one slave child out of that expedition. So this was the evidence that was shown in the UK Parliament and among the UK public that they had done good for the natives by rescuing them. So I will come to in the chapter 5, I discuss the study village where I lived and conducted my fieldwork among the Imchungan Nagas. It is here I developed my field-based knowledge on how agriculture was transformed in modern Naga villages, a perspective that is different from project officials and scientific experts' opinion on Sweden cultivation in the Naga hills. The villagers were active both in settled paddy cultivation and jhum farming in the hill slopes. The transformation, as I discovered, came through a distinct process of Baptist ethics of work, time discipline among the Nagas, Bible worship, and changing land and labor relation and also political party patronage. So unlike the popular imagination of Christianity and missionization in mainland South Asia, where Americans, Welsh, and Scottish missionaries came to convert the population from the plains of Assam, in the case of my study village, the native missionaries were Nagas themselves, who were converted by their fellow Naga followers. Once a village headman got converted, he would start a new Bible fellowship and Sunday prayer service in the village, which evolved to convert the entire village population. The first church in these villages were built in the 1970s. The first missionaries carried baskets of rice and promoted rice cultivation over other coarse grain, particularly the millets and job tears, which were used to make beer and other intoxicants. So the missionaries worked with state officials to bring about improvement in the village. During the 1970s, as the Public Works Department provided mandates for labor work, the Baptist converts contributed 1/10 of their earning to build the magnificent village church, which I will show. The church is in the middle of the village and is the center of political power and attraction in the village. And which is quite different from what it used to be in the past, because the chiefs were the kingmakers in the village. So first elections were held in the region in late 1970s as they remained the blank space of the empire, which I have already explained. In the beginning, few Naga jhum farmers got the incentive to cultivate rice as it was not used to make homegrown beer. It also did not bring social prestige to the cultivators as the chiefs did not value it for feast of merit. But over a period of time, the converts banned the consumption of rice beer as they grew in strength because it went against the tenets of the preaching of the church, and rice was perceived as a food crop of more advanced neighbors who were more developed. Sunday was still not the rest day. One of the Ao Naga missionary, who was popularly known as Rentiba, came to the village in the early 1970s, and I heard stories from villagers, and he started preaching Bible and taking the Sunday revival services. So he imbibed among villagers ideas of hygiene, cleanliness, and peace. He also started regrouping the village based on the age-old Naga tradition of age set. Like in Naga society, the whole hierarchy is not based on caste or class, but it's based on age sets. That means people are divided from, let's say, age 0 to 50. So children would kind of stay at home, elders would go to the forest, would go to the farmer's field, and the more elderly people would kind of, do other kind of activities. So this whole arrangement was redesigned by the church leaders. So the most productive labor came from the younger population aged between 20 to 40. This was followed by the creation of a village body called Citizen, which I have got picture here in this slide. I think I missed it. Yeah, this is the one. So here you can see the citizen pillar. And why it is important is because the political structure within the village was based on the chief's power. The chief would control the village. He would redistribute resources. But with the coming in of the Christian missionaries, and particularly the creation of the village church, this citizen pillar became more important as an entity of political power. And these abundant murung houses. What are murung houses? Were male dormitories. So the Nagas would kind of spend their time in the murung houses after coming back from a hard day's work. But now these are all abundant structures, and the citizen's pillar has become very important because the power is now concentrated on the church, and the church kind of allows redistribution of resources in the villages.
What is the meaning of the GB next to the names?
Oh, sorry. So GB is the Gaubura, who is the village headman. So as you can see here in this pillar, all the Gaubura's names are mentioned. So the Gauburas who were earlier amnest now had converted to Christianity and had kind of taken the church important positions within the church. Their names were enlisted. This citizen pillar was created on the 25th anniversary of the institutions being established. So this became the center of political power. I don't mean to say the pillar itself, but the institution of the church became the center of political power because all the reciprocal relationship that the chiefs enjoyed were now taken over by the church pastor, because the villagers would contribute 1/10 of their wealth to the church, and the church would help them during famines, during periods of crisis. So there was a major transformation in the social structure and the hierarchy within the village in Nagaland. And that kind of brought about agrarian change. That is what my argument is. The agrarian change came not through technological intervention, not through subsidies, not through loans that were given to the people, but through changes that were coming in the social structure of the village. So now I'm coming to with regards to land use and land relation. And there has been a significant turn in the last 5 decades. In traditional Naga society, land was not completely privately owned by individuals and families, which is the case in most other parts of the world. The village headmen and chiefs acted as the custodians of clan land and gave it to families for cultivation. The fallow land was zoomed for 2 seasons and would then be returned back to the forest land to be cultivated after 10 to 15 years when the fully grown forest had come up. So the campaign to promote wet terrace rice farming and settled agriculture transformed land relations slowly but steadily. Influential villagers took over uncultivated marshland along the valley to transform them into paddy fields. Like as you can see in these pictures, these areas were never cultivated. Let's say 30 years back, they were barren, uncultivated wastelands, and these were the kind of zoom plots. But as you can see, the zoom plot is only restricted to a small geographical area. Beyond this, you have got plantations. So what I'm trying to argue in this book is that zoom cultivation has significantly changed with different kinds of zoom innovations, like for example, plantation of horticultural crops, trees, and other forms of agriculture. And that is kind of changing not only the crop choices, but also land relation, because more and more land is becoming private, and there is increasing case of landlessness in villages, because these lands were initially free for everybody to kind of claim on them. But once you have permanent husbandry, like we have permanent teak plantation or let's say wood plantation, this results in permanent settlement of that forest for a particular individual, and until and unless you kind of cut the trees or sell the timber, you don't give it back to the village council, and the village council can then not redistribute that land. Same is with the case of paddy fields. You don't keep it fallow, you just keep it fallow for 1 season, and then for the next year you just keep on cultivating. So these transformations that are coming both in the highland and in the lowland have actually changed the social structure of the village, where there are more resourceful people, more rich people, and there are more poor people. So the whole idea of egalitarian social structure that the Nagas once had has been transformed and changed. So that is another kind of finding that I had while doing my fieldwork. So government programs to replace Swidden farming with permanent settled agriculture became an opportunity for village brokers and influential henchmen to appropriate free resources such as subsidies, seed supplies, and cash for land development, poultry and piggery for farming, by forming self-help groups and experimental farm societies. People who knew government agri department officials and frequently visited the town benefited from free seed supplies, and they planted it in their farm. As the tree matured over a decade, the land never became fallow for zoom cultivation. Today, a variety of plantation crops dot the landscape, along with horticultural crops like oranges, lemon, passion fruit that are grown by villagers. This has made the Swidden village compete for land. The change in land use to curb Swidden farming is slowly ending the flexibility of communal ownership over farmland that once existed when there was no plantation or terrace rice plots. And you can see how the agricultural landscape is changing from hoeing, which they used to do in the zoom field, by using traction plow. And that has led to more sedentary land use. And as you can see, these were the different activities that I participated with the villagers when I was doing fieldwork. You can also see in the highlands, different varieties of commercial crops are coming up, which is making the land more permanent. There is no kind of rotation of the field. They are all settled.
Did they use any motorized machines?
Not really. In fact, it's very interesting to note that the traction plow that you see here is hired from a neighboring village, which had much wider area or acreage under this to call wet terrace rice cultivation. So they have not even reached to that stage where they know how to use traction plow. So that's a far cry. So as you can see here, when I was doing field work, I kind of encountered these groups of scientists who had come from Chennai, Tamil Nadu, to kind of document the biological diversity, the medicinal plants that are available in this region. So this is a NGO called SECON. It's a Salim Ali Center for Ornithology, that is a very famous institute which is based in South India. And they were kind of doing bird watching to identify the rare species of birds that are available in this part of the world. And also they were kind of, as you can say, they had caught a snake to kind of, to see if it is a kind of unique new variety that they could then do taxonomical classification. And they were using local knowledge of the people. They were showing the birds to the local people, and they were trying to understand if people knew about these birds, or they have sighted these birds, the village hunters who regularly do hunting. But why this is important, why I'm talking about it, is this idea of conservation has taken hold over people in Nagaland. Now people want to conserve all the landscape. And these ideas are coming from the government, from the NGOs, from international donor agencies. But what is the result of these kind of transformation is that people are becoming more alienated from the land. People are becoming more disenfranchised, and which is the point that I'm trying to kind of reiterate in my book, that by bringing in such development, you are actually breaking the traditional structures and the kind of harmony that people initially had, where money was not that important. What was important was kind of the affiliation, the reciprocal relationship, the kind of kinship ties that people had with their neighbors, and free labor was available. But with the coming in of these different institutions like the church and development organization, the cash has become so important in the local barter economy. As you can see, more pictures of how the landscape has become very diverse. You have banana plantation, you have maize being cropped. Maize is grown with long beans, which is a nitrogen fixing crop. So every time you grow maize, you relay it with long beans, and then you grow maize, you relay it with long beans. So land becomes very productive. There is multiple crops that are being produced. Long beans is kind of sold in the market. It is also contributed, given to the church. So in that way, and here is orange tree plantation. So all commercial crops that are being kind of promoted. But what is interesting to note in all these changes that are taking place in the landscape is that only few people are benefiting out of these developmental interventions. A select group of village middlemen, brokers, who have connections with the outside world, who have connections with the government officials, who are networked with the political intermediaries, benefit out of these projects. That is what I found out from my survey. And it's not to the benefit of the whole society. And that is where the problem lies. And that is where we need to kind of reconsider our ideas of development. So it is bringing about more inequality than justice. So that's what the problem is.
Were the locals aware of the profit being made from their work?
Yes, they were, but the problem is in Naga society, like in other tribal indigenous society, the clan affiliations are very important. So if the clan leader says, okay, I'm going to do this, people would follow them. And now these clan leaders kind of use a lot of power, political power. That for example, just before the election season, they would come and say, well, we will give you these many saplings if you vote for our political party. And that would be the means to garner vote for the political leader, and for the villagers to build patronage within their clan members. So people follow the leader. And they do know that these developments are not long lasting, and they are very short lived. But they would participate because, for example, one villager, if he gets a plot of land where he can plant, let's say, oranges, he still benefits out of that for the short term. So he would kind of be enticed to participate, although he knows that in future his political intermediary would benefit more from that kind of enterprise. So that's very important. So So in the penultimate chapter of the book, I discuss how well-conceived plans of development that aim to settle Jhum cultivation through microcredit and seed supplies backfires and results in individual village patrons like the village headman and political go-between sponge development money and benefit from the programs while leaving the rest of the village population impoverished. At the end of the project phase in 2007, where I started the NAPET project that I was looking, they selected this village which I studied, the Lankungar village, as a model village, because the village had shown that they had grown long beans with maize as a success story. So what the project officials decided then is that they should kind of promote ginger and cardamom. And they created this self-help group within the village where each households were given 20,000 rupees. Beneficiaries were selected by the village intermediaries. It was not by the outsiders like the project staff. And those money would be used to grow these crops. But then what resulted is nobody kind of participated in the project in the sense that nobody could produce any substantial crop which could be marketed. And why this happened is because the project officials didn't realize that the former project success was only possible because the church had committed the local people to contribute 10% of their produce. So the labor which was used during the cropping season went into producing long beans and maize and rice. So they neglected the crops that were kind of given through the subsidies, and that they knew that even if they were not successful in growing this crop, these were not their food crops, so they would still survive and they would still maintain the patronage with the village church. So the project officials didn't calculate the kind of social dynamics in the village. They were just technologically managing the project in the sense that if they were successful in the other project, they would also be successful in this project. So I discussed that in the last chapter of my book. And finally, what I've tried to kind of narrate here is that the book tries to challenge these ideas and constructions of Naga society by opening up the discussion of what is claimed to be modern agriculture. Here the ideas proposed by one of the scholars like Bruno Latour, who has written a lot on science and technological studies, is important to understand that we have never been modern. The environmental challenges that Sweden farming brings to the landscape is complicated by changing social and land relation in Naga villages, where egalitarian social structure is today replaced by hierarchies and social differences based on non-access and appropriation of wealth. I think I will conclude here because I've spoken a lot. But what is important to understand here is that the changes that have come in the Sweden cultivation landscape has actually minimized the number of diversity in the wilderness. Like, for example, if you look at plantation farming actually doesn't lead to biodiversity, it actually reduces biodiversity. Like, I found out in the village that people were consuming rice and they had increasing incidence of diabetes, which was not recorded in the previous period. So it's very difficult to judge that modernity and development brings improvement within communities. It can also bring about the demise of the community. So that is what I've tried to show in the book. And here you can see other images where how rice has become so central in people's everyday use. And you can see these different instruments being used to grind rice, which was not the case a few decades back, where people used to grow millets and job tears. And millets and job tears, interestingly, had a very long shelf life. You could keep the millet seed for 10 years. And at a time of famine, you can use those stored grains and transplant them on the field and have a good harvest and survive. But with rice, you cannot keep them for more than 2 seasons. So these are the limitations, as this last picture shows how the agricultural landscape in the village is transforming. All this landscape that you can see from the hilltop was barren. It had there was no cultivation taking place. But now today the land has been partitioned, it's all privatized. You have got terrace rice cultivation taking place. The irrigation department has created irrigation facilities in these areas, and people are kind of growing rice. And also, if you look at people's cuisine, this would not have been the case in the past. As you can see, people are consuming fish, they're consuming rice and long beans. In the past, it would have been millets, job tears, and no fish and meat. So there is a significant change in how people kind of have changed over a period of time in a period of last 3 to 4 decades. So I've tried to map this change, the contemporary change, and I've also tried to look at the historical change, which has come through colonialism and how the colonial state kind of intervened into the life of the Nagas. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for taking us through the journey of your research and your chapters. How can people get hold of your book?
It's right there, and
How much is it?
it's priced very heavily. I don't know, because it's a discretion of the publisher, which I have already suggested them to kind of reduce the price. It's, I think, around £70. But now, today, if you buy the book, it's like they are giving 20% discount. No, you don't have to buy it today if you order it today. So that's
And you mentioned a lot of your writing you've written in EPW about all sorts of things, slavery, and I'm definitely going to be looking you up. Along with millet, you mentioned another
job steers. It's a buckwheat.
buckwheat. Okay. And are there any questions, Mr. Reds? Hamidullah? Could you expand a little bit on the connection with salt and shondip?
Yeah. So that's a very interesting connection. So if I show you this picture here, the map, in fact, I don't have the full map of the Bay of Bengal, unfortunately, but at least this map would highlight that the Nagas are based here, and here is the state of Manipur. And Manipur is actually linked with the Chittagong Hill Tracts. And through these territories, you have the largest rivers flowing. Like you have the Brahmaputra, you have got small tributaries of the Brahmaputra. So the Sandip Island was a major area where salt was produced. Before land reclamation started in the late 18th, 19th century in the whole Deltic part. And salt was traded from these areas through small boats. So there were a lot of political and kind of, principalities and intermediaries, particularly in the state of Tripura, which lies close to Manipur, below Manipur, and which is kind of bordering with Sylhet and other places, sorry, not Sylhet, but other districts of Bangladesh, particularly Kumulla. So the salt was then transferred through riverine trade. One thing we have to understand in the context of South Asia and the Northeast is that today we see the whole of South Asia as a landlocked kind of. The idea of South Asia comes from maps. In the sense that we have the territory carved out as the Northeast, which is surrounded by Myanmar, China on the north, Bangladesh in the south. But during the colonial times, we didn't have these boundaries. We didn't have these borders. So people could move very freely without holding a passport or without having a kind of entry requirement. So the mobility was from the sea. So if you look from the perspective of the sea, you will have a totally different worldview of the whole of South Asia. Like, for example, places like Gujarat, Kutch, the Rann was more connected to Africa than the other parts of Asia, because there was huge trade going on between the Indian Ocean world, which we call as the Indian Ocean region. So there was this mobility of people across cultures, across boundaries, across linguistic barriers. So as you can see in this map, there are so many different linguistic and ethnic denominations within the Naga territory, and this map itself kind of breaks those boundaries, because the Naga territories are spread across the whole of South Asia and Southeast Asia, because it brings two regions together. So the salt trade was so important. Because the Nagas were independent, but they only needed salt to survive. So it was through Assam that the salts were brought. And we see colonial records where the salt trade was kind of monitored, or let's say taxed by the colonial government. The trade was going on, but the colonial state would take profit out of it. So it became a problem for the Nagas. And similarly, opium was going the other way. It also came from Southeast Asia and from China. So all these kind of movements of goods and commodities were kind of in a way managed by the colonial state, so that they could make profit out of it. Yeah.
If growing particular crops for cash is a problem, is there some way of promoting a more diverse crop? It seems that people were grown in a less intensive way, many things, and that was giving them a variety of diet and a variety of access to different bits of the landscape. And the church came along, and others, and promoted an alternative. Is there somebody who's going to go in you and promote a sort of a variation on the way that it used to be, more diverse, more common land approach?
Yeah, in fact, there are classic examples that I noticed while doing my survey, while doing my fieldwork, that the people have already kind of developed mechanisms of growing crops which were semi-commoditized, to use Henry Bernstein's word. Like he's a retired professor emeritus from SOAS, and he has worked in Latin American highlands. And he used this term called semi-commoditized crops, where people grow the crop both for household consumption and also for sale in the market. And that is interesting because you don't kind of sacrifice your crop for commercial use, and you have the kind of a security, social security, in the sense that you have the food security within the village. So people were experimenting with, as I have shown, maize and long beans, which was not their primary food crop, let's say, even during the 1970s. So in the 1990s, it became a prime crop, because people were growing maize with long beans. Maize was used in the household. Long beans were also used in the household, but then they would trade in that crop. And that was successful, and people were making good profit. In fact, in one of the Agri Expo that the Nagaland government organized during the Republic Day celebration, I think, they kind of showed the different genotypes of long beans. Long beans is actually what we call in South Asian languages rajma, which is a very kind of nutritious bean. It's grown currently in South Asia, particularly in Himalayan belt. And the quality of that long bean is far inferior to what is grown in Nagaland. And some of the long beans have even been exported to Germany to see if there can be commercial ventures developed where German kind of companies could import and sell it in their supermarkets. But then that has not seen the light of the day. But what I'm trying to say is that such interventions, or let's say such innovations which farmers have developed through their local networks, are kind of very suitable alternatives to what has been promoted by transnational development organizations. Sorry?
Who will promote those developments?
I think it's the people who need to initiate those movements, and at the same time the governments and the transnational organizations should kind of understand the sensitivity in the field, like among people, what are the aspirational needs. Like, for example, the developmental monies which were given under the NAPET project to the villagers were mostly used for sending children to school, paying their tuition fees, buying medicines. But then to an economist or to an expert, that would be wastage of wealth. But for the villagers, it was very resourceful because they could educate their children. They could kind of bring improvement in their health. So it's a very interesting kind of dynamics that we need to understand, that what are people's preferences, what are people's choices. So it cannot be always monetarily defined or kind of examined in terms of what is profit and what is the loss and what is the gains. So I'm trying to point in that direction. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, what caused you to want to specifically research this subject? Was it something that came to you by chance as you were there? Was it something you deliberately saw and went to investigate further? And how long did it take you to do all this?
I think it's a very excellent question that you've asked me. From my childhood, I've been told by my mother that, you get this jhum pumpkin, and it tastes very good because it's organic. It is kind of comes from the highlands. And in reality, it used to be more fresh. It has to taste good. So this idea of jhum has been revolving in my mind subconsciously from my childhood, because in the schools and in the college curriculum, there used to be one chapter which they would explain that jhum is kind of a kind of a very primitive form of farming, and people should abandon it. And in the northeast, it is seen as a big problem because it is causing floods, it is causing soil erosion, it is causing deforestation. So there are several projects on the run which are trying to find solution to this problem. But then the dilemma is, even the scientists agree that it is a way of life. Like, if you take up at least 10 research papers, or let's say grey literature in the northeast, where they have written about jhum, they would say that although we understand that it's a problem, it's a way of life. So how do we reconcile between these two worldviews? One is the expert view of saying that, well, this needs to be stopped, or we need to find alternative livelihood for the people. And the other discourse, the more cultural kind of discourse, is that it's a way of life and people cannot abandon it, because their rituals are also linked with Jhum cycle. Festivals, their kind of social practices are linked to Jhum. I have not shown here the table which kind of shows the list of celebrations they have all around the year, like the harvest festival, the sowing festival, the post-sowing festival, and it is linked to particular calendrical time, which is important for the villagers, and they cannot just give it up just because we want to change our agriculture. And then once I kind of did my master's, I went to JNU, as I mentioned. And at that time, I was looking at a completely different topic. And my MPhil dissertation was on hydrology, in terms of looking at dam building in the northeast, particularly over the Brahmaputra, and how flooding is a big problem, through which I think I came in touch with Fuad, like we were discussing about these techno-managerial practices in managing floods. And then what happened is I kind of thought I should look at something new. And as I was attending this seminar, because my supervisor in JNU was also present, he was like kind of the moderator of the seminar, and the professor was there. And when he spoke about this whole thing, I thought that I should go and meet him, and he invited me to come and meet. And then this whole process started in my mind. And I got engaged with this project. And it took nearly 7 years, more than 7 years, to kind of write this whole book, transform the whole thesis into a book, and kind of do more work, do more field work, do more archival research, because archives was not something which I would normally go to, because I'm trained as anthropologist, as a geographer. So that way, my kind of perspective changed when I came to SWAS, because my supervisor, who works on tank irrigation in South India, he said that archives are very important to understand people's history, people's past. So that is how I kind of landed in doing this work.
What I was asking, in 2011, I went to the Chittagong Hill Trek, and I took thousands and thousands of photographs. I saw fire on hillsides.
Yeah.
And I also saw burnt out, hilly areas. Right?
Yeah.
But in Chittagong Hill Trek, you have Bengali settlers moving in, and that's introducing different kind of dynamics, right? In the Nagaland area, are there any settlers from other parts of India moving in, or it's still like only the local people who have been there for generations? New population moving into the area from other parts of India?
Yeah. Here I think the colonial archives gives us very important light. In the late 18th and 19th century, when tea plantation was expanding over these territories, the British brought in coolie laborers from central India, the indentured laborers, whom we can say. So there is a huge, coolie population in the tea gardens, which were very close to the foothills, and who came in conflict with the Nagas. Then the Nepalese came from Nepal. They were very good woodcutters. So there are a lot of Nepali settlements all along the Brahmaputra plain. Then we have the Bengalis who came as clerks who joined the railway services. They also worked as tea garden managers. So there were a lot of different shades and caste of population who had come into this region. And the current dispensation in Assam, as you might have read in the newspaper, that the government of India passed this new bill, comes out of these kind of historical contingencies, because the struggle between the hill people and the plain people. And in Dimapur, which is a kind of plain area, Dimapur was a moza, which was part of Assam and then made part of Nagaland, and the inner line regulation kept on shifting from 1870 to 1920, and Dimapur was made part of Nagaland, and there are a lot of plain people kind of settled in that area. But in the high mountain areas, mostly the people are kind of Nagas, belonging to different social groups and clans. Yeah.
I've read, I've been following it for the last 2 years, but I've read that the people in Assam and the northeast, a lot of them are adopting Christianity as a form of identity to differentiate from Bengalis and Indians, And how true is that?
I think the whole question of indigenous, Christianity is very important, and I think that is all. What you have said is true. Is not completely kind of a false notion, but then I think Christianity in Nagaland particularly is not about differentiating people. It's about kind of more indigenous, in the sense that, as I have explained, that they have grown from the village, unlike the Catholic missions, who kind of fund their fellowship from above. Here the villagers have to develop their own resources to run the church.
So how are
So-
the, say like you talked about the tea settlers who were brought in, have they I mean, it's like, I think last year Sri Lanka said that the tea settlers can't have their citizenship, even though they've been there 300-400
Yeah,
years
yeah.
by the British. And do they have a problem?
Yeah, there is a big problem in Assam today, where indigeneity is defined by your ancestry. Like, for example, in Nagaland, the Nagas would say that we are the indigenous people of Nagaland. But then the whole idea of indigeneity is a very contested term within the discipline of anthropology and sociology, because who is indigenous is very difficult to define, because these people had migrated from China, from Southeast Asia, but because they have lived over that land for a long period of time before the colonials came and invaded those territories, they claim to be indigenous. But then in Assam, the problem lies with the tea tribes. The tea tribes claim all over India they are recognized as the scheduled tribes, but in Assam they are not, because it comes in conflict with the Assamese identity. Where the Assamese people are trying to claim that there is a pan-Assamese identity. That means all the tribes who live in Assam, all the castes who live in Assam, should follow a particular identity, that is the Toi Ahom identity, which the local people, the different tribes, including the tea tribes, contest. And because the political power is with the Assamese people, they would never allow the tea tribes to have any kind of meaningful, kind of what you can say, rights that they would like to exercise in terms of getting a special status within the state. So yeah, there is a big conflict that exists. And in fact, the tea tribes are one of the most disenfranchised poor communities in Assam today. They have very low levels of literacy. They have very low levels of public health. And they are just kind of, in fact, the tea tribes have their own language, which is quite distinct from what they used to speak in their, home country. And that is also called as the tea tribe language, like which they speak, and they are out of political power. They sometimes become vote bank of certain political entities and then shift to other political. But their concerns have never been addressed because they don't have any political mileage within the state of Assam. But they are a significant population because they live.
Can they vote?
Yeah, they can definitely vote, and they do vote. But then what I'm trying to say is that they don't have a special status as other tribes have in Assam, like the Bodos. They have the special status, they have the autonomous council, and they have special kind of jurisdictional powers, which the tea tribes don't have, and they should have, like, in the sense that because they have been historically marginalized and they have been part of this indentured regime, which has been discussed so widely in different subaltern studies literature, in Marxist literature, in literatures that have been produced by peasant studies. So they should have a right within that context. But because this whole ethnicity comes into the whole picture, because Nagas claim to be indigenous ethnic sons of the soil in Assam. That is which is also very popular in Indonesia, where the Bhumiputra, the idea of being the son of the soil. In Malaysia, in Malaysia, the Bhumiputra. So in Northeast, this idea of son of the soil comes first than anything else. So I think the ethnic identity plays over all other forms of identity, whether it is religious, whether it is political, whether it is social. So ethnicity is so important, which I think should be given due importance, but not at the expense of marginalizing others.
I think it would have been really nice to have you speak alongside one of our previous speakers, Leili Uddin, on Pashani and the struggle against the line system.
Yes.
that comes to my next question
Mhm.
to you. I liked how you talked about coloniality and like expansion, like it's North American, like Turtle Island being occupied by these strange Europeans, but this zone this is where the opium that drugged the Chinese, that Asia was turned upside down,
Yeah.
all over here. But coming from my background, I'm seeing, so I'm from Sylhet, and our political leaders were all about abolish the line system. It's hard not to see like a state. I mean, sometimes when you're just looking at pictures, you say that's wasteland. Now it's rice. Now it's fertile. Even when you try not to, it comes out, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But how's your thinking about land and change developed as you've done this? Do you see these kind of static lines or a kind of a fixed Naga nationalism as productive for the Naga people, or have you got any hope for kind of a plurinational thing working out? Because Assam is quite a zone of oppression for a lot of people. You can just see it from my grandfather's house.
Yeah, I think it's a very pertinent question that you have asked, and it's not. I don't have a straightforward answer for this question, but what I feel is that Naga nationalism has its own grounding, its own political claims, but it can also be very parochial in the sense that if we challenge a nation state and try to create another nation state, the people living within that nation state, some of the societies, some of the communities or tribes can be marginalized. Like, for example, the places where I did my fieldwork is in eastern Nagaland, and very few people have researched on the eastern Nagas because they are not accessible. And in fact, my first choice was not to settle in an eastern Naga village. It is through an interlocutor who lived in that village and who worked for the second team, invited me to his village, and that is how I landed up in that village. And most of the people who live in these areas have also been given some special status, like reservation in attending schools, colleges, because they come from a backward district. So there's also this department called the Backward Area Development Fund. So the state itself kind of creates these different categories to kind of accommodate people and kind of govern. So this whole idea that you have kind of put up is important and interesting, but I don't have at this point of time a straightforward answer. But I think it's a thing that needs to be thought about. Develop.
So any other questions?
On that map there, where's the border with Myanmar? The heading at the top says India and Myanmar.
Yes.
Where's the border with Myanmar?
Yeah, and that's very interesting because this map has been produced in such a way that it kind of crosses the political boundaries and kind of brings the ethnic identities together. So as you can see this line, this is the boundary between India and Myanmar. And interestingly, when I was doing fieldwork in Nagaland, I went to the archives. This boundary was not settled until the 1960s. Although India and Myanmar kind of attained independence in the late 1940s, the Indian premier and the Burmese premier were deciding on trigonometrical surveys in the late 1950s. So this boundary was only carved out in around 1960. And that's why there is a lot of dispute because the people in Manipur claim that their productive land has been given to Myanmar, and the Myanmari government kind of claims that a lot of their productive land India has kind of claimed. So there has been kind of trade-off. So I was looking at those classified files where the government of India is negotiating with the Burmese premier and to carry out trigonometrical surveys in these areas. Because, as I said, that these areas were unmapped and they were not part of the colonial empire. And as Edmund Leach writes in one of his articles that he published in the late 1960s, where he talks about, and he actually uses a map which shows that there has been no cartographic survey in that area. It's actually a part here in this section, in the Shan territory, northern Burma. And that becomes a very interesting kind of viewpoint, and how this landscape can become contested. Like we have today the McMahon line, which is contested between India and China, but at the same time we have these boundaries which remain contested because we have the artificial emergence of nation state, and these ethnic boundaries could not be reconciled. So the people are divided across borders, and they feel the pain of being separated. So that's like a very interesting
Is
thing.
travel either side of that?
Yeah, they do. In fact, this whole kind of lookist policy and all this kind of new paradigm of development of moving people are kind of getting connected, but it's not the way they used to do in the past. Things have changed. Like there are border patrols, there are border guards who would control your mobility or check your mobility. So yeah, they do have these hut bazaars. They have these annual fairs. People do go to Myanmar, and Myanmari people come. The Nagas from Myanmar come to India. They do their marketing, go back home. So yeah, there is the exchange still existing. But the borders are not that permanent as it in the western frontier with Pakistan, like where they have fenced border. But here it's like manned border. People would just patrol in this border.
Is there any population pressure from the east
I don't think so.
with all the problems in Myanmar?
Yeah, I know. There is not much population because these areas are quite thinly populated in both sides of the border, and people have got enough land to kind of cultivate and survive. It's more about the kind of choices they make in what they want to cultivate. Like this whole Tangia problem, which was was seen as a solution for the Karens in northern Burma, kind of failed. And Ramonel Bryant in his book gives a very graphic account of how the Karen National Army kind of then proposed the British Indian government to kind of gain independence, because they helped the British to kind of populate the landscape with Tangia farming. But then the colonials, Tangia is a kind of improvement over Jhum. So the Jhum cultivation is like you burn the forest and go away, but the colonial state kind of introduced this improvement that you burn the forest and then replant it with teak and other kind of product, so that people can then reforest the area. But then it was not suitable for that environment. Then the trees didn't grow to the size they wanted.
Is that an intermediate technology?
Yeah, kind of intermediate. Yeah, and even in Assam they have tried it. So in different parts.
Now it's the last question.
Yeah.
I have one more.
One more after the last thing. Okay. This Nagaland, was it part of Burma before the British captured it?
Yeah, the whole of Assam was subjugated to the Arakan state before the coming in of the British. But then the Nagas were kind of independent, even under Ahom rule, and even with the Burmese coming in, they were acting as vassal chieftaincies who would kind of aid the Ahoms in times of war. They would collude with them, and then they would give political support. But they were not under their control in terms of paying taxes. In fact, as I mentioned, there was kind of these free spaces where the Nagas could come down and kind of tax the local population. They could go back to the hills. So there was this flexibility in political administration. But then that changed with the coming in of the British, because they created these hard borders, and it became more estranged after independence, because now we have this whole idea of nation state, and you cannot go beyond the framework of the nation state.
So can I ask a quick one? During this burning process, surely there was a lot of destruction of all the flora, fauna, the natural things in the forest, in the vegetative conditions. Was there any thought given to it, that destruction, and did any of it come back?
Yeah.
The reforestation?
Yeah. So this complete destruction of forest that we see in pictures, in photographs, is essentially not kind of destroying the whole forest, because these people have developed in-depth knowledge of their environment over centuries of farming. They know when to sow, like they use this moon calendar, like full moon, half moon. I have not described all these things because it will take a lot of time and it will be complicated for people to understand. And it is only on particular moon cycles that they could sow the seed, otherwise there will be crop failure. So they have this generational knowledge. So they don't just blindly burn the forest. They burn the forest to kind of have that they would not bring peril to their own environment, because then that would lead to famines and deaths and destruction, because then they have to migrate from that area if they could not cultivate that land after 20 years when they come back to that area. So that way, it's not about, like if you look at, there are a lot of environmental history work done in Africa. So burning has been seen by the scientific community to be a waste, to be a very dangerous thing to be done to the environment. But now new researchers, particularly some researchers done in Sussex University by James Fairhead and his colleague, have shown that burning is helpful for the environment. A lot of research has been done in the Australian landscape. It shows that burning actually brings back variety of biodiversity back to the environment. Yeah, the burning which takes place with relation to a timber forest being completely lost may result in kind of loss of biodiversity. But within the Jhum landscape, people are not only growing one variety of crops, they grow a variety of crops, like for example tubers, they grow chilies, they grow food grains. So it is mixed cropping that takes place in the Jhum fields. It's not monocropping. So that itself defines the diversity is maintained within that landscape. Yeah, but definitely there can be some loss of biodiversity, which is, but then that would not endanger the sustainability of that land.